My husband traded my late father's vintage car for a motorcycle. 2 months later, he got his biggest karma. My father passed away when I was 28 after fighting cancer for 2 years. He left me his 1969 Chevelle that we'd restored together when I was in high school. Every weekend for 3 years, we worked on that car in his garage, replacing parts, fixing rust, painting it the perfect shade of blue. He taught me about engines and life during those hours under the hood. When he got sick, he made me promise to keep the car running and never let anyone tell me it was just metal and parts. It was our shared heartbeat, he said. I married Craig 2 years after Dad died. He seemed supportive about the car at first, even said it was cool I knew how to fix engines. He'd grown up wealthy with parents who bought him new cars whenever he wanted, so he thought my attachment was cute and quirky. We kept the Chevelle in our garage under a cover, and I'd take it out for drives on Sundays just like Dad and I used to do. Craig had his own BMW that his parents leased for him, so we never fought about vehicles. For 3 years of marriage, everything was fine. Then Craig discovered motorcycles. His coworker brought a Harley to work and let Craig ride it around the parking lot. Craig came home that day talking about freedom and the open road and how cars were prisons compared to bikes. I said that was nice and figured it was a phase. It wasn't. Craig started going to motorcycle shows every weekend. He joined online forums about bikes. He bought leather jackets and helmets before even owning a motorcycle. He kept showing me pictures of bikes that cost more than our annual grocery budget. I told him we couldn't afford a motorcycle right now since we were saving for a house. He said we had money sitting in the garage gathering dust. He meant the Chevelle. I told him the car wasn't for sale and never would be. He said I was being selfish, keeping a valuable asset locked up for emotional reasons. I reminded him it was my father's car, left to me, titled in my name only. He said married couples shared everything, and I was being a hypocrite since I drove his BMW sometimes. One Thursday, I came home from my nursing shift to find the garage empty. The Chevelle was gone. Craig was in the living room with a helmet on his head, grinning like a child. I asked where my car was. He said he'd made an excellent trade that would benefit both of us. He'd traded the Chevelle to some collector for a brand new Harley Davidson and $3,000. He said the bike was worth more than the car and we could use the money for the house fund. I asked him to repeat what he just said because I couldn't believe it. He actually traded my dead father's car without my permission for a motorcycle. He said I was overreacting and the car was just sitting there anyway. I told him he stole from me. He said wives can't steal from husbands because everything is communal property. I showed him the title in my name only from before we married. He said that was just paper and real marriages didn't work that way. I called the collector Craig traded with. The man said Craig told him I'd agreed to the trade but was too emotional to be there. He said Craig showed him photos of us together to prove he was my husband. He felt bad but said the trade was final and he'd already started dismantling the car for parts. He was lying about that last part but wanted to keep the car. I called the police. They said it was a civil matter since Craig was my husband. I called a lawyer who said I could sue but it would be expensive and Craig technically committed fraud, which was criminal. Craig got angry saying I was trying to ruin his life over a car. His parents called, saying I was being materialistic and should appreciate Craig's initiative in making profitable trades. His mother said the motorcycle was more practical anyway, and I should be supportive. Craig started riding the Harley to work every day, posting pictures online about his new lifestyle. He joined a motorcycle club and went on rides every weekend without me. He said I couldn't come because I didn't understand the culture and would kill the vibe with my negativity. 2 months later, Craig crashed the motorcycle. Craig crashed the motorcycle going 80 miles per hour, showing off for his new biker friends, totaling it beyond repair with no collision coverage because he'd been too cheap to pay for full insurance. While he was in the hospital with 2 broken ribs, I tracked down the collector who had Dad's Chevelle and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. I grabbed my phone and pulled up Alan's number, my hands steady despite the anger burning through my chest. The hospital room where Craig lay with his broken ribs felt very far away as I hit dial. Alan answered on the 3rd ring, his voice cautious when he recognized my number. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I had the title in my name. I had proof Craig lied about my consent, and I had a lawyer ready to file criminal charges for receiving stolen property. Alan could either work with me or explain to a judge why he accepted a car from someone who had zero legal right to trade it. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up, but then he cleared his throat and started talking about expenses. He'd already put money into storing the Chevelle, he said, and he'd paid for an initial assessment of the car's condition. His voice had that defensive edge people get when they know they're wrong but don't want to admit it. I cut him off mid-sentence. Those costs were his problem, not mine. He accepted stolen property, and any judge would see it my way given the documentation I had. The car was titled solely in my name before I married Craig, which made it separate property under state law. Alan had no legal leg to stand on, and we both knew it. I gave him 48 hours to think about my offer before I filed the police report and the civil suit. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either, which told me everything I needed to know about his position. That evening, Melody showed up at my door with 2 bottles of wine and a large pizza. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug before I could say anything. I led her to the dining room table where I'd spread out every piece of documentation I had. The title to the Chevelle sat in the center like evidence at a crime scene, surrounded by copies of my marriage certificate, the police report I'd filed, and notes from my consultation with the lawyer. Melody poured us both generous glasses of wine and settled into the chair across from me. I walked her through everything that had happened over the past 2 months, starting with the day I came home to find my garage empty. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from shock to anger to something that looked like determination. When I finished talking, she refilled our wine glasses and told me about Roderick. Her husband was a mechanic who specialized in classic cars, and he could assess the Chevelle's current condition if I could get access to it. A professional evaluation would strengthen my position with Alan and might even help with Craig's insurance situation, though I doubted Craig had been smart enough to insure that motorcycle properly. Melody pulled out her phone and texted Roderick right there at my table, explaining the situation in quick bursts of typing. He responded within minutes, offering to help however he could. Having someone with actual expertise on my side felt like the first piece of good news I'd had since this nightmare started. The next day, I drove to the hospital to visit Craig. I found him in his room complaining to a nurse about the pain medication not working fast enough, and how the hospital food tasted like cardboard. The nurse gave me a sympathetic look as she left, and I wondered how many times she'd dealt with Craig's whining since he'd been admitted. He didn't ask how I was doing or apologize for anything. He just launched into a list of complaints about his broken ribs, the uncomfortable bed, and how bored he was stuck in this room. I stood at the foot of his bed and watched him talk, seeing him clearly for maybe the first time in our marriage. This was the man who'd stolen my father's car without a second thought, who'd traded away something irreplaceable for a motorcycle he could show off to his new biker friends. He expected me to feel sorry for him, to bring him things and comfort him, as if he hadn't destroyed the most important thing I owned. When he finally paused for breath, I asked him about the motorcycle insurance. His face went pale, so fast I thought he might pass out. He admitted he only had liability coverage because full collision insurance was too expensive for a bike that nice. The words hung between us like a confession of guilt. I felt something cold and satisfied settle in my chest as the reality sank in. Craig had destroyed a $30,000 motorcycle with no insurance to cover it. His parents had always bought him cars, leasing him that BMW he drove like it was nothing. But he'd purchased this bike himself with money from his job. He'd been so proud of that fact, posting about it online and telling his biker friends how he'd saved up for it. And now it was gone, totaled beyond repair, with nothing to show for it except medical bills and broken ribs. The bike was worth more than the Chevelle had been, or so Craig had claimed when he made that trade. But at least the Chevelle still existed somewhere, sitting in Alan's facility. Craig's motorcycle was scrap metal in a junkyard, and he'd have to pay off the loan himself with no insurance payout to help. I didn't say any of this out loud. I just stood there and let him see the satisfaction on my face. Craig tried to change the subject, asking when I was bringing him clothes from home. He needed his comfortable sweatpants and his favorite shirts, he said, because the hospital gown was awful. I looked at him lying there in that bed, still expecting me to serve him after everything he'd done. I told him I wasn't his servant, and he could ask his mother to bring him things. After all, she was the one who thought I was so materialistic and unsupportive. She could support him herself if she cared so much about his comfort. Craig's face flushed red and he opened his mouth to argue, but I turned and walked toward the door. I'd said what I came to say, and I had no interest in listening to more of his complaints. I was halfway down the hall when I heard heels clicking on the linoleum behind me. Craig's mother called my name, her voice sharp enough to make other visitors turn and stare. I stopped and turned around, watching her approach in her expensive outfit and perfect makeup. She looked like she was heading to a country club lunch, not visiting her son in the hospital. She caught up to me and immediately demanded to know why I wasn't being more supportive of Craig during his recovery. He was injured and in pain, she said, and I should be there for him instead of whatever I was doing. Something inside me snapped. I was done being polite to this woman who'd raised her son to think he could take whatever he wanted without consequences. I told her exactly what her son had done. I explained how he'd stolen my dead father's car and traded it without my permission for a motorcycle he then destroyed through reckless driving. I described coming home to an empty garage, finding Craig grinning in the living room with a helmet on his head, learning he'd traded away something irreplaceable for his own selfish desires. She tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. I told her about the title in my name, about Craig lying to Alan by claiming I'd agreed to the trade, about the police calling it a civil matter because Craig was my husband. Her face shifted from anger to something more defensive as she realized other people in the hallway were listening. She lowered her voice and said marriages required compromise, that I needed to be more flexible and understanding. I looked her right in the eyes and told her theft wasn't compromise. What Craig did wasn't a disagreement about finances or a difference of opinion. He stole from me, plain and simple, and no amount of her making excuses would change that fact. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number, turning away from me to speak. I didn't wait to hear what she said to whoever she called. I walked past her down the hallway, my shoes squeaking on the clean hospital floor, and I didn't look back. Other people in the waiting area stared at me as I passed, but I didn't care what they thought. Let them judge me for not standing by my injured husband. They didn't know what he'd done or how he'd treated something precious to me like it was garbage. I made it to the parking lot before the tears started, hot and angry on my cheeks. I sat in my car for 5 minutes just breathing and trying to calm down enough to drive safely. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I kept seeing Craig's face when I mentioned divorce. That flash of real fear in his eyes. Good. He should be scared. He should understand there were consequences for stealing from the person who was supposed to be his partner. I drove to Melody's house without thinking about it, my car taking the familiar route while my mind replayed everything that had happened. She opened the door before I could knock and took one look at my face before pulling me inside. Her living room smelled like the vanilla candles she always burned, and the familiar scent made something inside me crack open. I started crying for real then, not the angry tears from the parking lot, but deep sobs that came from somewhere dark and painful. Melody wrapped her arms around me and held on while I fell apart. She didn't ask questions or tell me it would be okay, or offer any of the empty comfort people usually gave. She just held me and let me cry until my throat hurt and my eyes burned. I cried about my father and how much I missed him, about coming home to find the empty garage, about 3 years of marriage to someone who never really saw me. I cried about the Chevelle sitting in some stranger's facility while Craig rode around on his stupid motorcycle posting pictures online. I cried until I had nothing left inside me except exhaustion. Melody made tea and sat with me on her couch while I explained everything in a shaky voice. She listened without interrupting, her face getting angrier as I described the hospital scene with Craig's mother. When I finished, she squeezed my hand and said Craig's mother could go straight to hell for defending what her son did. Then she told me her husband could help. Roderick knew cars inside and out, worked on them every day at his shop, and he'd be able to tell me exactly what the Chevelle was worth. That information would give me power when dealing with Alan and with Craig's family. I stayed at Melody's house that night, sleeping in their guest room because I couldn't face going home to the empty house I'd shared with Craig. In the morning, Roderick sat down with me at their kitchen table and pulled out his phone to show me recent auction results for restored Chevelle. He scrolled through listings and pointed at prices that made my stomach flip. A car like mine in good condition could sell for $40,000, maybe more depending on how complete the restoration was. Some went for $60,000 if they had matching numbers and original parts. That was way more than Craig's motorcycle had cost, which meant he'd made a terrible trade even from a purely financial standpoint. Roderick wrote down the numbers on a piece of paper and told me to use this information when I talked to Alan again. If the collector knew I understood the car's real value, he might be more willing to negotiate. I called Alan from Melody's kitchen, my hands steadier now that I had actual information to work with. He answered on the third ring, and his voice sounded wary when he recognized mine. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him I wanted to make a deal that would benefit both of us and keep this situation from getting uglier. I offered $15,000 for the Chevelle's return, which would cover whatever he'd paid Craig, plus give him a profit for his trouble. In exchange, he needed to give me written documentation stating that Craig had lied about my consent for the trade. That documentation would protect Alan if this became a legal issue, and it would help me in divorce court. Alan didn't answer right away, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, he said he needed time to think about my offer. I told him he had 48 hours before I filed a police report for receiving stolen property and started a civil lawsuit. I kept my voice calm and professional, but I made sure he understood I wasn't bluffing about legal action. After I hung up, Melody suggested I talk to a divorce lawyer while Alan was thinking things over. She knew someone named Marlene who specialized in cases where one spouse had committed fraud or theft. I made an appointment for later that same day. Marlene's office was in a building downtown with dark wood furniture and law books lining the walls. She was maybe 50 years old with gray hair cut short and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through my nervous energy. I showed her the title for the Chevelle with my name only, the text messages where Craig admitted to making the trade, and screenshots of his social media posts showing off the motorcycle. Marlene read through everything carefully, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she looked up, she said I had a strong case for fault-based divorce because Craig had stolen my separate property. In our state, anything owned before marriage stayed separate unless both people agreed to share it. Craig had no legal right to trade the Chevelle no matter what he claimed about married couples sharing everything. His actions were both criminal theft and grounds for divorce with favorable terms for me regarding asset division. Marlene explained that separate property meant exactly that, separate. The car wasn't marital property just because I got married while owning it. Craig couldn't claim any right to it or make decisions about it without my permission. What he did was legally no different from if he'd stolen from a stranger, except worse because he violated the trust that came with marriage. She said judges took this kind of betrayal seriously, especially when it involved deceased family members and sentimental items. The fact that my father had left me the car and Craig knew its emotional significance would work in my favor during proceedings. Marlene asked about Craig's motorcycle accident and whether he had insurance coverage. I told her he'd only carried liability because he was too cheap for collision coverage on such an expensive bike. She made more notes and said Craig's financial irresponsibility would help my case if he tried to claim he deserved spousal support. A man who bought a $30,000 motorcycle without proper insurance and then destroyed it through reckless driving wasn't someone a judge would see as financially responsible. I asked what would happen with Craig's medical bills from the accident. Marlene tapped her pen against her notepad and explained those bills were Craig's responsibility because he got hurt doing something reckless and stupid. I wasn't legally required to pay for medical care that resulted from his own bad choices, especially when those choices violated our marriage by destroying stolen property. If Craig tried to argue I should help with his bills, Marlene would point out that he created this situation himself by trading my car, buying an expensive motorcycle, failing to insure it properly, and then crashing it while showing off. Every bad decision was his alone, and the consequences should be his alone too. 2 days later, Alan called back and agreed to my offer. His voice sounded tired, and he admitted he'd felt uncomfortable about the trade from the beginning. Craig had been pushy and insistent, showing pictures of us together and talking about how I was too emotional to handle the transaction myself. Alan had wanted to believe Craig was telling the truth because the Chevelle was exactly the kind of car he loved collecting. But something had felt off about the whole situation, and now he knew why. Getting documentation that Craig lied would protect Alan legally if I decided to pursue criminal charges, or if Craig tried to sue him later for returning the car. He asked when I could transfer the money, and I told him I'd have it wired that same day. I went to my bank and emptied most of my savings account, watching the balance drop from $22,000 down to $7,000 in a single transaction. That money represented 2 years of picking up extra nursing shifts and skipping vacations and being careful about spending. I'd been saving for a house down payment, for a future I thought I'd be building with Craig. Instead, I was using it to buy back something Craig had stolen from me. My hands shook as I signed the wire transfer paperwork, but I didn't hesitate. Getting my father's car back was worth every penny, even if it meant starting over financially. The Chevelle represented my relationship with my dad, 3 years of working together and learning from him. No amount of money could replace that, and I'd spend every dollar I had to protect it. The bank transfer processed by noon, and Roderick picked me up early the next morning in his pickup truck. He brought coffee in a thermos, and handed me a cup without saying much. We drove across town to Alan's facility, which turned out to be a converted warehouse with a dozen garage bays. The building looked professional, with security cameras mounted on every corner and a coded gate at the entrance. Alan met us in the parking lot wearing coveralls and wiping his hands on a rag. He led us inside through a side door, past rows of vintage cars in various states of restoration. Some were stripped down to bare metal while others gleamed under protective covers. The air smelled like motor oil and metal polish. We walked through 3 bays before Alan stopped and gestured toward the back corner. There sat my Chevelle under a car cover in a climate-controlled section separated from the main workshop by glass walls. My hands started shaking before I even pulled the cover off. Roderick helped me lift the fabric away, and there it was. The blue paint looked exactly how I remembered, the same shade Dad and I had spent weeks choosing from sample cards. I ran my fingers along the hood, feeling the smooth surface and the familiar contours. The chrome bumper still had the tiny scratch from when I'd misjudged a parking space during my senior year. Every detail matched my memories perfectly. Alan cleared his throat and pulled a manila envelope from his jacket pocket. He handed it to me along with the keys, which still had my father's old keychain attached. The envelope contained a notarized statement describing how Craig had misrepresented the trade, claiming I'd agreed to it but was too emotional to be present. Alan had written down every detail of their conversation, including how Craig showed photos of us together as proof of marriage. The statement ended with Alan's admission that he should have verified my consent directly before accepting the trade. He looked uncomfortable as I read through it, shifting his weight from foot to foot. When I finished, he spoke quietly and said he hoped I could get the car back where it belonged. His voice sounded genuine, not like someone trying to avoid legal trouble, but like someone who actually felt bad about the situation. I thanked him and meant it. Roderick spent the next 20 minutes inspecting the Chevelle from every angle. He crawled underneath with a flashlight, checked the engine compartment, examined the interior and trunk. He tested the lights and horn, looked at the tires and brakes. When he finished, he reported that Alan had kept the car in excellent condition. No parts had been removed or replaced. The oil was fresh, the battery charged, the fluids all topped off. Alan hadn't lied about planning to dismantle it. He'd simply lied to discourage me from pursuing its return. The car was exactly as I'd left it that Thursday when Craig stole it from our garage. Something in my chest loosened, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for 2 months. Roderick asked if I wanted him to drive it home, but I shook my head. This car was mine, and I needed to drive it myself. He followed me in his truck as I backed the Chevelle out of the bay and through the facility gates. The engine rumbled to life with that familiar deep sound that vibrated through the steering wheel. I adjusted the mirrors and seat, finding everything still positioned exactly where I'd left it. As I pulled onto the main road, tears started running down my face. The car still smelled like my father's garage, that mix of old leather and motor oil and the pine air freshener he always kept hanging from the rearview mirror. The passenger door still had the little dent from when I'd backed into Mrs. Henderson's mailbox during my first solo drive at 16. Dad had laughed about it instead of getting mad, saying every car needed character marks to prove it was actually driven and not just displayed. The 20-minute drive home felt both too long and too short. I wanted to keep driving forever, feeling my father's presence in every familiar creak and rattle. But I also needed to get the car secured in my garage before Craig's mother drove past and saw it. When I pulled into my driveway, Mrs. Smith from next door came out of her house immediately. Then Mr. Grayson from across the street walked over. Within minutes, 5 neighbors had gathered around the Chevelle, all asking questions and expressing relief that I'd gotten it back. They'd noticed it was gone, and several had asked me about it, but I'd been too upset to explain. Now they congratulated me on recovering it, and Mrs. Smith hugged me tight while saying she knew how much the car meant to me. Mr. Grayson mentioned he'd seen Craig loading the motorcycle into the garage and thought something felt wrong about the whole situation. I thanked them all and drove the Chevelle into the garage, parking it in its exact spot under the overhead light. The moment I cut the engine, I got out and changed the garage door code on the keypad. The old code was our wedding anniversary, which now felt like a sick joke. I picked a new code using my father's birthday instead. Then I installed a steering wheel lock I'd bought online, the kind that required a key to remove. I disconnected the battery cables as an extra precaution, tucking them away where they couldn't be easily reconnected. Craig wasn't getting near this car again, not even if he somehow got into the garage. My phone rang around 7 that evening while I was making dinner. Craig's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring 4 times before answering, keeping my voice neutral. He started talking immediately, his words coming fast and angry. He demanded to know where I'd gotten $15,000. His mother had driven past our house and seen the Chevelle in the driveway. She'd called him right away, furious that I'd wasted our savings on a car when he was lying in a hospital bed injured. I stirred the pasta on the stove and waited for him to finish yelling. When he paused for breath, I explained calmly that the money came from my separate savings account, not our joint account. Every penny was mine, earned from extra nursing shifts I'd picked up over 2 years. I'd used my own money to recover stolen property that belonged to me. Craig's voice got louder, saying I was being vindictive and punishing him while he was injured and vulnerable. He called me selfish and cruel. I turned off the stove burner and sat down at the kitchen table. My voice stayed level as I told him his actions had consequences. One of those consequences was that our marriage was over. I'd already filed for divorce with Marlene, and he'd be served with papers as soon as the hospital released him. The line went silent for several seconds. Then Craig's anger shifted into something that sounded like panic. His voice cracked as he started making promises about how he'd change and make everything right. He said he'd buy back the Chevelle somehow, that he'd understood now how much it meant to me. He begged me to give him another chance, saying the accident had taught him what really mattered in life. I looked at the framed photo of my father and me standing next to the Chevelle on the day we finished restoring it. We were both covered in grease and grinning like idiots. I told Craig it was too late for apologies or promises. I should have left the first time he called my father's car just metal and parts. That moment had shown me exactly who he was, and I'd ignored it because I wanted to believe he could understand. But he couldn't, and he never would. I hung up before he could respond. His mother called an hour later. My phone lit up with her name and I almost didn't answer, but I knew she'd keep calling until I picked up. Her voice came through the speaker loud and sharp, demanding to know how I could abandon Craig when he needed me most. She said I was cruel and heartless, that a real wife would be at her husband's bedside instead of plotting against him. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone on speaker, letting her rant while I ate leftover pasta. When she finally paused for breath, I told her quietly that her son abandoned me first, when he stole my most precious possession. I was simply returning the favor by protecting what was mine and ending a marriage built on disrespect. She started to argue, but I hung up before she could get another word out. The next morning, I drove to Marlene's office with all my documentation organized in a folder. She reviewed everything carefully, making notes on a legal pad while I sat across from her desk. Marlene said we had an excellent case and she'd file the divorce papers that afternoon. She explained she'd also request exclusive use of the marital home during proceedings, since I could prove I was the primary financial contributor through my nursing income and savings. Craig's name wasn't even on the mortgage, which I'd paid down significantly with my separate funds before we married. Marlene made copies of the Chevelle's title, Alan's notarized statement about Craig's fraud, and my bank records showing the separate savings account I'd used to recover the car. She said these documents would shut down any claims Craig or his parents tried to make about marital property. I signed the paperwork and left her office feeling like I'd finally taken control of my life again. 3 days later, Marlene called to tell me Craig's parents had hired Duncan Perry, an attorney known for representing wealthy families in messy divorces. Duncan had already sent over a lengthy response arguing that I was being unreasonable and vindictive. He claimed Craig had made a business decision about marital assets in good faith, trying to improve our financial situation by trading an unused car for a more practical vehicle and cash. The argument completely ignored that the Chevelle was never marital property, and that Craig had committed fraud by lying to Alan about my consent. Marlene sounded annoyed but not worried when she explained Duncan's strategy. She said expensive attorneys often tried to overwhelm the other side with paperwork and aggressive arguments, hoping to force a settlement favorable to their client. Marlene scheduled a meeting with Duncan to address his claims before we went to mediation. I sat in her conference room while she laid out our evidence piece by piece. She showed Duncan the title documentation proving the Chevelle was my separate property from before the marriage. She presented Alan's notarized statement detailing how Craig misrepresented the trade and claimed I'd agreed to it. She produced copies of text messages where I'd explicitly told Craig the car was not for sale and would never be sold. Then she introduced evidence of Craig's financial irresponsibility, including his decision to ride an expensive motorcycle without collision insurance and his reckless driving that resulted in a total loss. Duncan tried to argue that married couples make financial decisions together, but Marlene cut him off. She said theft isn't a financial decision, and Craig's actions constituted both fraud and grounds for a fault-based divorce. Duncan's confident expression faltered as he realized his client had no legal ground to stand on. The mediation session took place 2 weeks later in a neutral office downtown. Craig arrived with Duncan, moving slowly and wincing as he sat down in his chair. His ribs were still healing, and he looked pale and uncomfortable. I sat across the table next to Marlene, keeping my eyes on the notepad in front of me. Craig kept glancing at me like he expected me to back down or show some sympathy for his injuries. I stayed focused on Marlene's guidance, letting her do all the talking while I remained silent and composed. The mediator reviewed our positions and asked if we could reach an agreement without going to court. Duncan immediately jumped in, claiming I should be more understanding of my husband's situation and consider reconciliation. Duncan's next argument was that I should pay half of Craig's medical bills since we were still legally married when the accident occurred. He said marriage meant shared responsibility for expenses, regardless of how those expenses came about. Marlene responded calmly that Craig's bills resulted from reckless behavior that violated our marriage vows and destroyed property he'd obtained through theft. She said I had no obligation to subsidize his poor choices, especially when those choices were made while he was deliberately excluding me from his new motorcycle lifestyle. The mediator seemed to agree with Marlene's position, noting that Craig's actions before the accident demonstrated a pattern of disregard for the marriage. Craig finally spoke up, his voice quiet and strained. He said he was sorry, that he didn't understand how much the car meant to me. He looked directly at me for the first time since the mediation started, his eyes pleading for some kind of response. I met his gaze and told him that if he truly didn't understand after 3 years of marriage, then he never knew me at all. My father's death, the restoration work, the Sunday drives, the explicit conversations about the car's importance, none of it had registered with him as real or meaningful. He'd seen an asset to exploit, not a piece of my heart that kept my father's memory alive. Craig looked down at the table and didn't say anything else for the rest of the session. We reached a settlement within an hour. I would keep the house, the Chevelle, and my separate savings account. Craig would keep his BMW lease that his parents paid for and all his personal belongings. We'd split the joint savings account 50-50, though it was mostly empty anyway since I'd used my separate funds for the house down payment and he'd spent his income on motorcycle gear and club dues. The division was clean and simple because we'd kept our finances relatively separate throughout the marriage. Craig agreed to everything without argument, probably because Duncan had explained he had no legal leverage to demand anything else. The final requirement was that Craig had to sign a document acknowledging he had no legal right to trade the Chevelle, and that his actions constituted theft of my separate property. This protected me from any future claims or attempts to argue he'd acted within his rights as a husband. Duncan advised against signing it, saying it could be used against Craig if I decided to pursue criminal charges. Craig signed it anyway, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote his name. I think he finally understood the full weight of what he'd done and just wanted it to be over. The mediator witnessed the signature and gave me a certified copy for my records. 6 weeks later, the divorce was finalized. The process moved faster than usual because Craig didn't contest anything after the mediation. He just wanted to move on and deal with his mounting medical bills without the added stress of a court battle. His parents were furious, according to Melody, who'd heard through mutual acquaintances that they blamed me for ruining their son's life. Craig himself seemed resigned to the outcome. I saw him one more time at the courthouse when we signed the final papers, and he looked tired and defeated. He'd lost his motorcycle, his marriage, and a significant amount of money in medical expenses, all because he couldn't respect a simple boundary about a car that was never his to trade. I scheduled my first appointment with Arabella McKnight 2 weeks after the divorce papers were signed. Her office was in a converted house downtown, the kind of place with comfortable furniture and soft lighting that made you feel less like a patient and more like someone visiting a friend. She specialized in betrayal trauma according to her website, which felt accurate since Craig's theft of the Chevelle had broken something fundamental in how I viewed relationships. The first session started with basic questions about my marriage and what brought me to therapy. I explained the whole story about the car, the trade, the accident, the divorce. Arabella listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she asked me to describe my relationship with my father. I talked about the restoration work we did together, the weekends in his garage, the lessons he taught me about engines and life. She nodded and made more notes. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She told me my anger at Craig was completely valid and justified, that he had violated my trust in multiple ways and stolen something irreplaceable. But she also said I needed to examine why the car held such power over me, and whether I'd ever properly processed my father's death, or just transferred all my grief into protecting the Chevelle. I sat there for a moment, feeling defensive. The car wasn't just a grief substitute, it was a real connection to my father, a tangible piece of our relationship that I could touch and drive and maintain. Arabella didn't argue with me. She just asked when was the last time I cried about my father's death, rather than about the car being taken. I couldn't answer that question. Over the next several weeks, Arabella helped me understand that I'd been protecting the Chevelle as a way to keep my father alive in my daily life. Every time I checked the car cover, adjusted the battery tender, or refused to drive it anywhere risky, I was trying to preserve him exactly as he was in my memory. She explained this was understandable given how traumatic his cancer death had been, but it also meant I'd never fully accepted his loss. The car was important and meaningful, but it wasn't my father. It was metal and parts and paint, just like Craig had said, though he'd used those words to diminish rather than clarify. My father's legacy lived in my memories, my skills, my values, not in the physical object we'd restored together. Separating those two things felt impossible at first. How could I honor his memory without protecting the car like a museum piece? Arabella suggested that maybe honoring his memory meant using the car the way he'd intended, driving it and enjoying it, and letting it be part of my actual life instead of a shrine. He'd restored it with me so we could experience the joy of driving together, not so I could keep it locked away forever. That perspective shifted something in how I thought about the Chevelle. My father had been practical and active, someone who believed tools and vehicles existed to be used. He would have hated knowing I kept the car covered and rarely drove it out of fear something might happen to it. He would have wanted me behind the wheel, feeling the engine rumble, experiencing the freedom he'd worked so hard to give me. Through therapy, I started to see that Craig's theft had actually forced me to confront questions I'd been avoiding for years about grief and attachment and what it meant to truly honor someone's memory. The Sunday after that realization, I took the Chevelle out for a real drive instead of just circling the neighborhood. I called Melody and asked if she wanted to come along. She showed up wearing jeans and a t-shirt, grinning as she climbed into the passenger seat. I backed out of the garage and headed toward the countryside, taking the two-lane roads my father and I used to drive when we first finished the restoration. The windows were down, warm air rushing through the car, and the engine purred perfectly beneath the hood. Melody asked where we were going, and I told her nowhere specific, just driving. She seemed to understand this was about more than transportation. As we passed farms and fields, I started telling her stories about my father that I hadn't shared in years. How he'd taught me to change spark plugs when I was 14. How we'd argued about the exact shade of blue for the paint job until we finally found the perfect color at a specialty auto shop 3 counties away. How he'd insisted I learn every aspect of the car's mechanics so I'd never be helpless if something broke down. Melody listened and laughed at the funny parts, and I realized I was talking about my father without the heavy weight of grief that usually accompanied his memory. The Chevelle wasn't keeping him alive, these stories were. The shared experiences and lessons and moments of connection, those were what mattered. The car was just the vehicle that had brought us together, literally and figuratively. Melody was quiet for a while after I finished talking, watching the landscape roll past. Then she asked if I'd ever considered selling the car to avoid all this pain and complication. I understood why she'd ask that question. She'd watched me fight for months to get the Chevelle back, and seen how much Craig's betrayal had cost me emotionally and financially. But selling it would be like selling my memories, erasing the physical proof that my father and I had created something together. The car represented our relationship in a tangible way that nothing else could. Every restored part, every hour of work, every Sunday drive was embedded in that vehicle. Craig trying to take it away had shown me who he really was, someone who saw value only in monetary terms and couldn't understand that some things mattered beyond their market price. I explained all this to Melody, and she nodded, saying she got it now in a way she hadn't before. The Chevelle wasn't about the car itself. It was about refusing to let someone else define what was important to me. Craig had tried to reduce my father's legacy to an asset he could trade for his own pleasure, and fighting back against that was about protecting something far bigger than a restored vehicle. 2 weeks later, I hired Marvin Cutler to conduct an independent appraisal of the Chevelle for insurance purposes. Marvin was a professional appraiser who specialized in classic cars, and Roderick had recommended him as someone who would provide accurate documentation. Marvin spent 3 hours examining every aspect of the car, taking photographs, checking the engine, inspecting the paint quality, reviewing the restoration records my father had kept. He measured panel gaps, tested the electrical systems, and even took the car for a short test drive to assess its mechanical condition. When he finished, he sat down with me at my kitchen table and went through his findings. The Chevelle's current market value was $52,000 based on its condition, documentation, and the quality of the restoration work. That number hit me hard because it meant Craig had traded away something worth far more than his $30,000 motorcycle. He'd gotten $3,000 in cash and a bike, walking away from a deal that lost me over $20,000 in value even before he crashed the motorcycle. Marvin could see the anger on my face and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, just processing the full scope of what Craig had done. Marvin said the documentation would help with insurance coverage and also provide legal proof of the car's value if I ever needed it for any reason. Before Marvin left, he mentioned he knew several collectors who would pay premium prices for a Chevelle with this kind of documented history and restoration quality. The fact that a father and daughter had restored it together over 3 years made it special beyond just the mechanical aspects. Collectors valued stories and provenance, and this car had both in abundance. He could put me in touch with serious buyers if I ever decided to sell. I thanked him for the information but explained the car would never be for sale at any price. My father had left it to me with the explicit understanding that I'd keep it running and never let anyone diminish its meaning. Selling it would violate that promise, and I'd already fought too hard to get it back to even consider letting it go now. Marvin smiled and said he'd expected that answer, but had to make the offer as part of his professional responsibility. He handed me the appraisal report in a leather folder and told me to keep it somewhere safe. The documentation was comprehensive and legally binding, which meant I now had official proof of what Craig had stolen from me. A month after the appraisal, Duncan called Marlene with one final offer from Craig's parents. They would pay me $20,000 if I agreed to give Craig the Chevelle as part of the divorce settlement. Duncan presented it as a generous compromise that would allow everyone to move forward, claiming Craig had learned his lesson and genuinely wanted to make amends. Marlene called me immediately to relay the offer and get my response. I told her absolutely not, and to inform Duncan that Craig's parents should never contact me again through any channel. The Chevelle was mine, legally and morally, and no amount of money would change that. Craig had stolen it once and destroyed any claim he might have had to it through his actions. His parents trying to buy it back for him just showed they still didn't understand the fundamental problem. They thought everything could be solved with money and negotiation. Marlene sounded satisfied with my response and said she'd make my position crystal clear to Duncan. She added that this was likely their last attempt since the divorce was already final, and they had no legal leverage. I agreed and thanked her for handling it. After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the framed notarized statement from Alan that hung on my wall. That document represented my refusal to accept Craig's version of reality, and I wasn't about to undermine that victory by selling him the car his parents wanted to give him. 3 months passed after the divorce became final. I settled into my new routine of work, therapy sessions with Arabella and Sunday drives in the Chevelle. Life felt calmer without Craig's presence and his parents' constant interference. Then one Thursday evening, I ran into Craig at the grocery store near my house. I was pushing my cart through the produce section when I saw him examining apples near the organic display. He looked different. Thinner maybe, and he was walking normally without any sign of the injuries from his accident. For a second, I considered turning around and leaving, but then he looked up and saw me. Recognition crossed his face and he actually started walking toward me. My first instinct was to tell him to stay away, but something about his body language seemed less aggressive than I expected. He stopped a few feet from my cart and asked if we could talk for a minute. I didn't owe him anything, but curiosity made me agree to listen. Craig told me he'd been in therapy too, working through his entitled behavior and learning about boundaries and respect. His therapist had helped him understand that his upbringing with wealthy parents who gave him everything had created a warped sense of ownership and control. He genuinely believed that being married meant having access to everything I owned, and he'd never considered that some things were separate and sacred. The way he talked was different from before, less defensive and more thoughtful. He said he finally understood why what he did was so wrong, not just legally, but morally and emotionally. Trading my father's car hadn't been a business decision or a smart trade. It had been a betrayal of trust that destroyed our marriage. He looked directly at me and said he was genuinely sorry for betraying my trust and stealing something irreplaceable. The apology felt real in a way his previous excuses never had. He wasn't trying to justify his actions or minimize the harm. He was acknowledging the full weight of what he'd done. I thanked him for telling me all that, but it didn't change what happened between us. What he did went beyond a mistake or a moment of bad judgment. He stole something that represented my entire relationship with my father, traded it away like it meant nothing, and that kind of betrayal doesn't just disappear because someone finally understands they were wrong. The line he crossed wasn't one I could uncross, and forgiveness felt impossible when I thought about coming home to that empty garage. Craig nodded slowly and looked down at his shoes. He told me he got it, that he didn't expect me to forgive him or want him back. Then he mentioned he'd been taking the bus to work every day for the past few months. His insurance rates after the accident were so high that he couldn't afford another vehicle right now, and his parents had cut him off financially to teach him about responsibility. They told him he needed to learn to live within his means and handle his own consequences. I felt a small flicker of sympathy hearing about his daily bus commute and his parents finally holding him accountable. But mostly what I felt was relief. He made choices that hurt me in ways I was still working through with my therapist, and now he was learning that choices come with costs. His discomfort riding public transportation and managing a tight budget wasn't my problem to solve. He created this situation himself when he decided a motorcycle was more important than respecting my boundaries. We stood there for another minute in awkward silence before he said he should let me finish my shopping. I watched him walk toward the exit with his small basket of groceries, and then I turned back to my cart and continued picking out vegetables. That encounter stayed in my mind for days, but I didn't let it derail the progress I'd been making. I focused on rebuilding my life without him, picking up extra nursing shifts on weekends and holidays to replenish my savings account. The money I'd spent recovering the Chevelle had put a dent in my finances, but the overtime pay helped me get back on track. My house felt peaceful now that it was just me living there. I could leave my car magazines on the coffee table without anyone complaining. I could eat cereal for dinner if I wanted. I could spend Sunday mornings working on the Chevelle in the garage without anyone telling me I was wasting time on a worthless hobby. Learning to enjoy my own company took some adjustment, but I found I actually liked the quiet. One evening while we were having dinner at her place, Melody suggested I join a classic car club to meet people who would appreciate the Chevelle's significance. She'd seen a flyer at the community center about a local group that met twice a month. I wasn't sure at first because I'd never been much of a joiner, but she pointed out that I might connect with people who understood the bond between a person and their vehicle. I attended my first meeting the following Thursday at a garage space one of the members owned. There were about 15 people there, ranging from a guy in his 20s restoring a Mustang to a woman in her 60s who'd inherited her husband's Corvette. Everyone brought photos of their cars and shared stories about restoration projects and weekend drives. When I showed pictures of the Chevelle and explained that my father and I had restored it together, several people nodded with understanding. A man named Robert told me about rebuilding a Camaro with his grandfather before he passed away. A woman named Olivia shared how she'd learned everything about engines from her older brother while working on his pickup truck. These weren't just car enthusiasts. They were people who understood that vehicles could represent relationships and memories and time spent with people we loved. Over the next few months, I became a regular at the club meetings. We organized group drives through the countryside and helped each other with mechanical problems. Through the car club, I met others who'd restored vehicles with family members, and we shared stories about those relationships. Robert's grandfather had taught him patience and precision. Olivia's brother had shown her she was capable of anything she set her mind to. My father had given me confidence and taught me that working with your hands was just as valuable as any desk job. Hearing their stories helped me feel less alone in my grief and more connected to others who understood what I'd lost. 6 months after the divorce became final, I found myself in a much better place. My savings account had recovered from the hit it took buying back the Chevelle. My therapy sessions with Arabella were helping me process both my father's death and the betrayal I'd experienced with Craig. The Chevelle sat in my garage exactly as my father had intended, driven regularly on Sunday mornings and maintained carefully. I changed the oil every 3,000 miles, checked the tire pressure weekly, and kept it waxed and polished. The engine purred smoothly, and the blue paint gleamed in the sunlight. I'd started dating casually, meeting people through work and the car club. Nothing serious yet, and I wasn't rushing into anything. Arabella said I was being smart to take time to heal and figure out what I really wanted in a partner before jumping into another relationship. She reminded me that I'd married Craig only 2 years after my father died, and I probably hadn't fully processed that loss before taking on the emotional work of marriage. I needed space to understand myself as an independent person, not as someone's daughter or someone's wife. My approach to dating now came with a simple boundary that I stated clearly from the first conversation. Anyone I dated had to understand that the Chevelle was non-negotiable. It wasn't just a car sitting in my garage. It was a legacy my father left me, a physical representation of our relationship, and I needed a partner who respected that without feeling threatened by it. If someone made jokes about me loving a car more than people, or suggested I should sell it to fund vacations or home improvements, I knew immediately they weren't right for me. The Chevelle was my line in the sand, and I wasn't moving it for anyone. I took the notarized statement from Alan that documented how Craig had misrepresented the trade and had it professionally framed. I hung it in my garage right next to my father's old toolbox, where I could see it every time I worked on the car. That document represented more than just a legal record. It showed that I'd fought for what mattered and won. It proved my strength and my refusal to let anyone diminish what my father and I had built together during those 3 years of weekend work in his garage. I picked a date about 7 months away from the divorce, marking it on my calendar. On what would have been Dad's 70th birthday, I woke up before sunrise and went straight to the garage. The Chevelle sat waiting, blue paint gleaming even in the dim light. I started the engine and let it warm up while I made coffee, listening to that familiar rumble through the kitchen window. By 7 in the morning, I was driving through empty streets toward the cemetery on the edge of town. The morning air was cool, and the sky was turning pink and orange as I pulled through the cemetery gates. I found Dad's grave in the section near the old oak trees, parking the Chevelle right beside his headstone. I sat in the driver's seat with the windows down and the engine running, just like we used to do when we finished working on the car and wanted to hear how it sounded. I told him everything. About Craig trading the car without permission. About the motorcycle accident. About tracking down Alan and negotiating to get the Chevelle back. About the divorce and starting over on my own. I promised him I'd kept my word about protecting what we built together, that I never let anyone convince me it was just metal and parts. My voice got shaky near the end, but I kept talking until I'd said everything I needed to say. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet for a while, watching the sunrise through the windshield. Melody pulled up around 8:30 in her sedan, carrying a thermos of hot chocolate and a bag of donuts. She climbed into the passenger seat and we sat together without talking much, just being present in the moment. After about an hour, we drove to Frank's Diner across town, the place Dad used to take me every Saturday after we finished working in his garage. The same red vinyl booths were there, the same black and white checkered floor. We slid into Dad's favorite booth by the window and I ordered his usual meal, a bacon cheeseburger with extra pickles and a side of onion rings. Melody ordered the same thing and we got 2 chocolate milkshakes, thick and cold in tall glasses. When the food came, we raised our milkshakes, and I made a toast to Dad's memory, to the hours we spent together under the hood of the Chevelle. to everything he taught me about engines and life and standing up for what matters. The burger tasted exactly like I remembered, salty and greasy and perfect. Sitting there in that booth, I understood something important that I hadn't fully grasped before. Recovering the Chevelle wasn't just about getting back something valuable that belonged to me. It was about honoring Dad's legacy and refusing to let someone else decide what mattered in my life. Craig tried to reduce 3 years of weekend work to metal and parts, tried to make me feel silly for caring about a car. But I proved it was so much more than that. It was memory and connection and time spent with someone I loved. It was proof that I could fight for what mattered and win. Life wasn't perfect now, but it was mine in a way it hadn't been during my marriage. I had my father's car sitting in my garage, maintained and driven regularly just like he wanted. I had my independence and my own space. I had my self-respect back after feeling dismissed and ignored for so long. I had a clear understanding of what I'd accept in relationships going forward and what crossed the line into disrespect. The Chevelle sat in my garage with its engine purring perfectly, ready for our next Sunday drive together, and that was exactly how it should be.